Today we're going to be talking about primary and secondary sources as part of social studies. So we're going to be learning about the first permanent English colony in Jamestown, Virginia, but we're also going to learn about it by looking at things that actually come from the time period that we're examining. So those are primary sources. When you ask yourself, how do people know what really happened back then? And how do we get this information, and how do we know what happened at Jamestown? Well, historians have to search for clues, and we find a lot of those clues as to what happened in primary sources, and we don't always have all the clues. So sometimes as people find new clues, they add new information and they may realize what they thought had changed. And so in that case, history can be changing too. It's not just a set of dates that stays the same. It's ideas and how people act and what they think and why they do things. And that's really what we want to understand. And we can do that by looking at primary sources. So the definition on your screen says primary sources provide a first-hand account of an event or time period. They represent original thinking, reports on discoveries or events, or they can share new information from that time. Often these sources are created at the time the events occurred. So what makes something a primary source is if we're studying Jamestown and it's the 1600s that we're studying, then if it's a primary source, it's coming from somebody who lived at that time, writing about or creating something from that time that we can then look at and use to get ideas about what's happening. And over here, there are some examples of what could be considered primary sources, like, important things like letters or diaries, things that people from then wrote to other people. Okay, maybe they were talking about current events, maybe they were sharing what they were doing at their farm, maybe they were writing back home about what life was like in the new world. Okay, birth certificates, court transcripts, biographies, autobiographies, interviews, speeches, newspaper articles, anything like that. Advertisements. As long as it comes from the time period you're studying, it's a primary source. Just briefly, to separate a primary source from a secondary source, what we usually use, or what you guys might be more used to using, is a textbook, a book that somebody wrote about the past telling you what happened. You don't necessarily explore as much in a textbook, it's just giving you information. But those are secondary sources. Secondary sources are things that people in the future, they take the information and they write it down for other people to understand. But it's not being written by somebody from back then. It's being written by somebody who studied it and is writing down information for somebody else to read. That's usually most of what you read when you're probably reading about history as a secondary source. But this year we want to try to use primary sources as much as possible. And so that's kind of where we're going to start today, is with some primary sources. Just an example of a primary source that we're going to use today. This is what I would call a modified primary source. And what that means is I kind of went into the original and took a look at it and wrote down some of the important points for you to make it a little bit easier to understand. But it does come from the original document. I'm going to show you a picture of the original document. So this is a picture of the original charter written that gives people in England permission to start a colony in Virginia. And it's actually several pages. You can see that there are some challenges to reading primary sources, especially from the 1600s. This one's kind of written in a form of like cursive, and some of the letters and spellings are a little bit different than what we're used to now. But what historians would do is they would take a look at these documents, these official documents, and they would use these documents to get clues about what was happening back then. So one of the things we're going to look at today is, why would they start a colony in Virginia? Okay, so why would they send people thousands of miles across the ocean to a place they'd never been to start another colony, especially after the first colony at Roanoke failed and everybody disappeared? So why are we going to keep doing this? So we want to learn about their motivations, their reasons for starting this. So I basically took this document and shortened out and took some parts out that I wanted you guys specifically to look at. Some things you need to do when you're looking at a primary source document is you need to do what's called sourcing the document. And what that means is you don't just look at it as something that you read, but you look at it as a clue or a piece from history, and you have to ask yourself some things about it. First of all, what is it? So I told you it was a charter. When was it written? It was written about 1607, before the first settlers went to Jamestown. So I'm giving you some of that background information. So what you have to do as a historian or as somebody who's looking at a primary source is, before you start reading it, you have to say to yourself, okay, this is a document that gives somebody permission, so it's a legal document that gives somebody permission to start a colony in Virginia, and you think about, what do I already know about colonies in the New World that's going to help me understand this document? We know the Spanish started colonies, the English, the French, the Dutch. We know that they were trying to get rich on resources from the New World, so we have all this background information. And then we use that background information to help us understand what's going on when we read it. All right? And we read it and we're not done. A primary source is not going to give you all the answers. What a primary source is going to give you is lots of questions, and then those questions will lead you to more answers. So what you would do is you would say, okay, here's my background information, here's my primary source, let's read it, let's try to make some sense from it. What do I think it means? And you would write down those thoughts. And then, what are questions I still have? Okay, and then you would write down those questions, because the questions are really important, because that's going to lead you to new discoveries. And I'm going to have you try to do this in groups today, and then we're going to discuss it.